I logged the Ilmer file the way I logged everything else that quarter, as a denial, filed and forgotten. One more line in a convoy manifest that had stopped surprising me months before it reached my desk. The Concord Migration Authority had ruled 3 times that the Ilmer Reef Communion could not be resettled. Not would not, could not. Their case officer's language was almost apologetic about it, in the bloodless way these things always are. A reef ark is not a ship, the ruling read. It is a living colony structure, thousands of coupled polyp mines distributed across a coral lattice the size of a small moon, and it does not travel. It grows toward a sun, and it dies without one. The authorities' own contingency plan, when their home shallows went toxic from an algae bloom no one could reverse in time, was to send a single sampling tender to core freeze a genetic library of the healthiest polyp clusters before the rest were left to bleach out in the dark. A seed vault, not a rescue. 400,000 distributed mines reduced to a hard drive. I had rooted worse denials without losing sleep over them. This one I read twice. What made me pull the file a 3rd time wasn't the science. It was the transmission attached to it, not a plea, not really, because the Ilmer don't beg the way most of the species I'd processed begged. It was a status report, the kind you'd send to your own kin, addressed to no one in particular because there was no one left listening who counted as kin. A single voice, speaking for the whole distributed colony the way one polyp cluster can speak for the reef when it has to. She gave her name as Koros, though I'd learn later that wasn't quite a name, more a designation for whichever cluster happened to be doing the talking that week. She said the light was going out of the water. She said the young clusters, the ones still soft, still forming their first thoughts, were the first to feel it. She said this without asking for anything, because asking had already failed her 3 times, and she'd apparently decided that a record, at least, could outlive the reef even if the reef couldn't. I was a logistics officer. I moved cargo and clearances and fuel manifests. I was not supposed to be the one who decided 400,000 mines lived or died. But I'd spent 6 years learning exactly how far a requisition could be stretched before someone above me noticed, and I stretched this one further than I ever had. I didn't file a rescue request. I filed it as salvage recovery, biological specimens, non-sentient classification pending, standard tow contract, because that was the only door in the whole Concord bureaucracy that didn't require 6 committees and a hearing. Then I called the one ship I knew wouldn't ask too many questions before it was already underway. The corvette Halloway wasn't built for this. She was a patrol hull, under strength, running with a skeleton crew because 2 of her engineers had rotated out the month before and nobody had backfilled the slots. Her captain, a broad, unhurried man named Osai, listened to the whole thing over a scrambled line and didn't say yes so much as ask what I'd need. What I needed didn't exist yet, so we built it. Habitat barges meant for hauling ice were refitted in 9 days with grow lattice cradles and nutrient flow rigging borrowed from 3 different agricultural tenders that weren't, strictly, mine to borrow. A hospital ship called the Verity came off a medical rotation 2 systems over and burned reserve fuel getting to us that she'd need to explain to someone eventually. None of it had authorization. All of it had a manifest that said salvage, biological, non-sentient, pending. A lie thin enough that anyone who wanted to stop us could have, and thick enough that nobody with the authority to stop us happened to be looking that week. We reached the Ilmer shallows on the 11th day, and I understood then what the authorities' ruling had actually described. The reef ark didn't look like a ship because it wasn't one. It was a living continent, kilometers of pale coral lit from within by slow blue-green pulses that moved cluster to cluster like thought traveling down a nerve, and the water around it had already gone the wrong color, a chemical haze thinning the light the reef needed to keep those pulses moving at all. Koros met us the only way a reef can meet anyone, through a relay buoy anchored at the ark's collapsed old trade dock, her voice coming through in that same unhurried, unbegging tone. She asked first whether we understood what we were looking at, not whether we could save it, whether we understood it was alive. I told her we did. I told her what we'd brought and watched, over the following hours, entire clusters of light along the reef's flank brighten and hold in a way our sensors couldn't translate, but that OSI's chief engineer swore afterward was laughter, or the closest thing a reef has to it. Towing a living moon is not fast work. There is no version of it that is fast. We spent 4 months at crawl speed, threading the Holloway and the Verity and 3 borrowed barges through a slow, careful transit designed around the reef's own biology rather than around ours. Light cycles maintained artificially, so the youngest clusters wouldn't stall out mid-growth, nutrient flow metered by hand every 6 hours by a rotating crew who'd never done anything like it and got better at it out of sheer stubbornness. OSI burned through fuel reserves nobody was going to reimburse him for. I burned through every favor I had left and several I didn't, keeping the Concord's attention pointed everywhere but at us. Somewhere in the second month, one of the borrowed barges lost its nutrient flow rig entirely. A coupling never designed for a 4-month haul finally sheared in the cold, and for 6 hours the cluster it fed went dark, pulse by pulse, faster than anyone on the Holloway had ever seen a light die. OSI's chief engineer, a quiet woman named Rourke who'd spent the tow learning reef biology from manuals nobody had asked her to read, rigged a bypass out of a spare fuel line, and 2 crew members rationed water, hand-metering the flow herself in 6-minute intervals because the automated systems couldn't be trusted to match the reef's rhythm. She didn't sleep for the better part of 2 days. When the cluster's light finally steadied back to its slow blue-green pulse, Koros told me afterward that the cluster remembered the interruption the way a person remembers a fever, as an absence it would carry, faint, for the rest of its growth. It survived. Not every cluster on the Ark's outer edge did, in the weeks that followed. 3 smaller ones, already weakened by the toxic bloom before we'd ever arrived, went dark for good despite everything Rourke and the Verity's doctors tried. Koros named them for me, unprompted. The way you'd want someone to remember the names of your own dead, and I wrote them into the ship's log under a heading no Concord auditor would ever think to search. Koros talked to me most of those 4 months, in that patient reef cadence, teaching me by increments what a distributed mind actually was, how the reef didn't experience the tow as rescue so much as migration, ancient and half-remembered from before her people settled the shallows and stopped needing to move. She told me the authority hadn't been wrong about the science. A reef genuinely cannot travel, not as a single vessel, not through any means her own people had ever built. She said what surprised her wasn't that we'd found a way. It was that we'd looked at the honest cost of doing it. The fuel, the time, the 4 months of a warship's crew hand-feeding a coral colony instead of doing anything a patrol corvette is meant to do, and hadn't decided the number was too large. We found the reef a new home in a system with a young, stable sun and shallows deep enough to hold the whole Ark without crowding, a system nobody else had filed a claim on because nobody else wanted it. The Verity's doctors stayed 3 additional weeks past their own orders, monitoring the youngest clusters through their first light cycle in the new water. I watched the reef's pulses steady into something closer to the pattern I imagined it had before the bloom, slow and even, like breathing. When the file finally came due, when someone above both OSI and me noticed a corvette, and a hospital ship had gone dark for 4 months on a salvage contract that any auditor with an hour to spare could unravel, I didn't wait to be called in. I requested transfer, permanent, as the Concord's sole standing liaison to a reef with no ship of its own, and no interest in ever needing one again. Koros asked me once, near the end of that first year, why I'd stayed instead of letting the posting rotate to someone else the way postings always do. I told her the truth, which was that I'd spent 6 years moving cargo nobody would miss, and I wanted once to be someone a whole world would notice was gone. She didn't answer that the way I expected. The reef simply brightened, slow and total, every cluster at once, in a pulse I never did get properly translated. I didn't ask her to. Some things are truer left that way.